Welcome back to the Roger Retrospective. One of the things I enjoy most about doing this podcast is taking a headline that's dominating today's news and asking a much older question. How did we get here? Because more often than not, the real story didn't begin yesterday or last year or even our lifetime. It began centuries ago. This week is a perfect example. Once again, the world's attention has turned to the Middle East. News anchors are talking about Iran, American military deployments, oil prices, naval patrols, and a place that suddenly becomes the most important piece of geography in the evening news, the Strait of Hormuz. If you watched the news of the past few weeks, you've probably heard experts say something like, if the Strait of Hormuz is closed, global markets could be thrown into turmoil. Now, most of us probably nod our heads and move on to the next story, but I'd like to stop for a moment and ask a different question. Why? Why should a narrow stretch of water, thousands of miles away from most of us, have the power to shake stock markets in New York, influence gasoline prices in North Carolina, affect inflation in Europe, and make governments from Beijing to London suddenly very nervous? This seems almost absurd when you think about it. After all, we live in an age of satellites, artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles, and global communications. Surely, a 21st century economy isn't dependent still on one little passage of water between Iran and Oman, and yet it is. That's because history is a funny way of reminding us that while technology changes incredibly fast, geography hardly changes at all. We tend to think that history is driven by extraordinary people, kings, presidents, emperors, revolutionaries, generals, entrepreneurs. We remember the names of Napoleon, Churchill, Roosevelt, Mao, and Steve Jobs. We tell history through biographies because people make for good stories. But sometimes history is not driven by people. Sometimes it's driven by mountains, sometimes rivers, deserts, and sometimes by a narrow strip of water that every ship has no choice but to sail right through. One of my favorite sayings comes from the American writer Robert Kaplan, who has written extensively about geopolitics. He argues that geography is the stage on which history is performed, politicians come and go, governments rise and fall, technologies evolve, but the mountains remain where they've always been, the rivers continue to flow in the same direction, the oceans still dictate where trade can move. In other words, geography doesn't care who wins the election, it simply waits. Today's leaders often behave as though they are making entirely new decisions. Historians know better. More often than not, they're responding to the same constraints that shaped emperors and kings hundreds of years ago. That's what makes the Strait of Hormuz so fascinating. The current crisis may dominate the headlines, but the importance of this place did not begin with Iran, didn't begin with oil, didn't even begin with the British Empire. Its story stretches back hundreds of years, long before anyone had ever heard the words Middle East or petroleum. In fact, I'd argue that today's headlines are simply the latest chapter in a story that began when wooden sailing ships first connected Europe, Africa, India, and Asia. To understand that, let's first appreciate just how small this place really is. Looking at a map of the Persian Gulf, at its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide. That's roughly the distance from downtown Manhattan to White Plains, or Raleigh to Wake Forest. 21 miles. That's all. On either side are rugged coastlines. To the north is Iran, the south Oman, and the UAE. Through this narrow opening passes roughly one-fifth of the world's seaborne oil exports, along with enormous quantities of LNG destined for Europe and Asia, who desperately need it. Think about that for a moment. An enormous share of the energy that powers factories in China, heats homes in Japan, fuels airlines in Europe, and keeps automobiles moving around the world must squeeze through a waterway narrower than many people drive during their daily commute. Civilization often depends on surprisingly fragile places, and Hormuz is not unique. If you've ever looked carefully at a world map, you'll notice something remarkable. Again and again, history seems to concentrate around narrow passages. There's the Strait of Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, the Bosporus, dividing Europe and Asia, the Suez Canal, linking Europe to the Indian Ocean, Panama Canal, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific, the Strait of Malacca, between Malaysia and Indonesia, through which much of East Asia's trade still flows. It's almost as if the world economy has an elaborate circulatory system and these narrow waterways are its arteries. Block one of them and the entire body feels it. It's not just true today, it's actually been true for thousands of years. One of the great lessons of history is that civilizations rarely become wealthy simply because they produce things. Quite often, they become wealthy because they stand at the crossroads where everyone else has to pass. Think of Venice, Constantinople, Singapore. Their greatest natural resource wasn't gold or fertile farmland, it was location. And long before oil transformed the Persian Gulf into the energy center of the modern world, there was another civilization that understood the simple truth better than anyone else. It was called the Kingdom of Hormuz. Most people have never heard of it. Yet for centuries, it was one of the richest trading states on earth. How did a tiny island kingdom become fabulously wealthy? Not because it had a great army, not because it possessed vast natural resources. It became rich because it controlled a doorway. As we'll see, that simple idea that controlling the doorway can be more valuable than controlling the destination would eventually shape the Portuguese Empire, inspire the British Empire, influence the rise of American naval strategy, and continue to shape international politics right up to the headlines we're reading today. So let's leave behind the world of oil tankers and aircraft carriers for a while. Instead, imagine the Persian Gulf 500 years ago. No pipelines, no supertankers, no fighter jets. Just wooden sailing ships, merchants from every corner of the known world, and a small kingdom that discovered one of history's greatest secrets. Sometimes the shortest route to power isn't conquering the world. It's controlling the place where the world has to pass through. And that's where our story begins. If I asked you to name the richest trading cities in history, you might indeed think of Venice, Amsterdam, London, or perhaps Singapore or Hong Kong. Few people would mention the Kingdom of Hormuz, myself included. Yet for several centuries, the tiny island kingdom at the entrance to the Persian Gulf was one of the wealthiest places in the known world. Its success tells us something profound about history. Sometimes the easiest way to become rich is not by producing more goods than everyone else. Sometimes it's by standing in exactly the right place. Long before Europeans rounded Africa, the Indian Ocean was already the world's busiest commercial highway. We often learn about the Silk Road in school, with its camel caravans carrying silk across Central Asia, but by the Middle Ages, the sea had become even more important than the land. Every year, ships sailed predictable routes using the monsoon winds. Arab merchants crossed from the Arabian Peninsula to India. Persian traders carried carpets, ceramics, horses. Indian merchants exported cotton. Chinese junks arrived loaded with porcelain and silk. Unlike the Atlantic, where weather can be unpredictable, the Indian Ocean had a rhythm. Sailors understood the seasonal winds. One part of the year, the monsoons carried them east. Months later, the winds reversed, carrying them back west again. It was almost like nature had created an annual shipping schedule centuries before modern navigation. Imagine standing on the docks of Hormuz around the year 1400. You would hear Persian, Arabic, Gujarati, Swahili, Turkish, and perhaps even Chinese being spoken around you. The harbor would be crowded with vessels from every corner of the Indian Ocean. Warehouses overflowed with spices worth their weight in gold. Pearls harvested from Gulf waters lay beside fine Indian cottons, horses, incense from Yemen, and silk from China. It was globalization long before anyone invented the word. Some wrote that the markets overflowed with jewels and precious goods from every direction. Others remarked that merchants dressed in fabrics and ornaments that would have made European nobles envious. There's one saying, if the world were a ring, Hormuz would be its jewel. Whether the phrase were literally true hardly matters. What matters is that people believed it, and here's the remarkable part. Hormuz didn't grow rich because it produced these goods. It wasn't famous for vast farmland or great mines. It became wealthy because geography had placed it exactly where ships entering and leaving the Persian Gulf naturally converged. Merchants stopped to pay taxes, they replenished supplies, they negotiated contracts, exchanged cargo. Every ship represented another opportunity to collect fees without ever planting a single field or manufacturing a single product. If this sounds familiar, it's because history keeps repeating the same pattern. Venice became rich because it connected Europe with the Eastern Mediterranean. Singapore, because it sits at the entrance to the Strait of Malacca. Dubai has become a global logistics hub because its location between Europe, Asia, and Africa. The products change, the principle doesn't. Control the crossroads and wealth often follows. As I was preparing for this episode, I couldn't help thinking about airports. Most travelers don't choose to spend a vacation in Atlanta because they simply love connecting flights. Yet Atlanta became one of the busiest airports in the world because of geography. The same is true of Dallas, Dubai, and Singapore. Millions of people pass through these airports without ever intending to stay there. Hormuz was essentially the international airport of the 15th century. Everyone passed through. Everyone paid something. Someone became wealthy. There's another lesson here that I think we sometimes overlook. When we picture history, we often imagine nations competing through military conquest, but commerce has always been just as powerful. Throughout history, merchants frequently built bridges long before politicians signed treaties. Goods crossed borders that armies couldn't. Ideas traveled with merchants. Religion spread along these trade routes. Technologies moved from one civilization to another because someone thought they could make a profit. Horrible, huh? Trade doesn't eliminate conflict, of course. Human beings remain wonderfully creative at ways of finding reasons to fight each other. But trade has always created networks that tie distant civilizations together in surprising ways. In many respects, the Indian Ocean was the medieval world's version of the internet, connected cultures that otherwise would have remained isolated from one another. Then something happened that changed world history forever. For centuries, Europeans had desperately wanted direct access to the riches of Asia. Spices were not simply luxury items. Preserved food, cinnamon cloves and nutmeg were incredibly valuable. Silk commanded astonishing prices, yet most of these goods passed through layers of middlemen before reaching Europe, making them enormously expensive. European kings began asking the obvious question: why are we paying everyone else? Why don't we sell directly to the source? The question launched one of history's greatest adventures. In 1948, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India by sea. It was one of the great turning points in world history. Europe had discovered a direct maritime route into the Indian Ocean, bypassing many traditional overland trade networks. But reaching India was only the beginning. The Portuguese quickly realized something far more important. They didn't need to conquer India. They didn't need to conquer Persia. In fact, they didn't need to conquer very much territory at all. Instead, they developed an astonishing modern strategy. Rather than controlling entire countries, they would control the bottlenecks, the narrow passages, the gateways, the places where ships had no choice but to pass. It was a brilliant idea because it allowed a relatively small European kingdom with a population of perhaps 1 million people at the time to project influence across an ocean stretching thousands of miles. And no one embodied that strategy more completely than one extraordinarily ambitious and sometimes ruthless man. His name was Alfonso de Albuquerque. When he looked at a map of the Indian Ocean, he didn't see coastlines, he saw chokepoints. He saw the Strait of Malacca, Goa, Hormuz. And he understood something that would shape global history for centuries. If you control the doors, you don't have to control the entire house. The next chapter of history will see how the Portuguese commander used that simple insight to build the world's first truly global maritime empire, not by conquering continents, but by controlling and conquering the narrow places where geography had already decided the world's continent had to pass. When most people think about great empires, they picture enormous armies marching across continents. They think of the Romans occupying Europe, or Genghis Khan riding across the Asian steppes, or Napoleon sweeping through Central Europe. The Portuguese did something completely different. In many ways, they invented a new kind of empire, one built not on conquering vast territories, but in controlling the seas. And that's remarkable when you consider who they were. Portugal was never a large country. Even in the early 16th century, its population was about 1 million people. Compare that with France, the Ottoman Empire, India, or China, all of which had populations many times larger. By almost any measure, Portugal should have remained a minor European kingdom tucked on away on the Atlantic coast. Instead, it became the first truly global maritime empire. How? The answer wasn't bigger armies. It was better maps. And perhaps more importantly, a completely different way of thinking about power. This man who got this right, Alfonso de Albuquerque, if you've never heard of him, don't feel bad. Outside Portugal, he's one of history's most underrated figures. Yet his influence on the modern world is enormous. He wasn't interested in planting the Portuguese flag over every kingdom in Asia. He knew Portugal didn't have the people, the resources to do that. Instead, he studied geography. He looked at the Indian Ocean almost like a chessboard. He asked a simple question: if I can't control the entire board, which squares mattered most? His answer transformed world history. He realized there were only a handful of places where almost every important trading ship had to pass. Control those places, and you could influence commerce across half the globe. It was a pretty revolutionary insight. Today we might call them strategic choke points. Albuquerque simply called them opportunity himself. His first great success came in India, where the Portuguese established themselves in Goa. Goa wasn't simply valuable because it was a prosperous city. It became the logistical heart of Portugal's Asian empire, a place to repair ships, resupply fleets, train sailors, and administer trade. Then came another target, the Strait of Malacca. If Hormuz was the gateway into the Persian Gulf, Malacca was the gateway into East Asia. Ships sailing between China, Southeast Asia, and India all converged there. By capturing Malacca in 1511, Portugal suddenly found itself sitting astride another of the world's great commercial intersections. Notice the pattern. Portugal wasn't collecting countries, it was collecting intersections. Then Albuquerque turned its attention back towards the Persian Gulf. Hormuz had fascinated European merchants for generations. Whoever controlled it possessed influence over the trade flow between Persia, Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the wider Indian Ocean. In 1507, Albuquerque first attempted to seize Hormuz, his initial campaign only partially successful, but after years of political maneuvering, Portugal firmly established his dominance there in 1515. The Portuguese constructed an imposing fortress overlooking the harbor. Even today, its ruins still stand as a reminder that a tiny European kingdom once projected power halfway around the globe. Imagine standing on those walls 500 years ago. Below you, ships arrive from India carrying spices, others from Persia with horses. Arab merchants unload dates and pearls. African sailors bring ivory. Every vessel entering or leaving the Persian Gulf passes almost directly beneath your guns. You don't need to conquer Persia. You don't need to conquer Arabia. You simply wait. The world comes to you. It's a remarkably efficient way to build an empire. In fact, it reminds me a little of owning a toll bridge. You don't need to own every factory on either side of the river. You simply collect a fee every time someone crosses. That's essentially what Portugal was doing on a global scale. This was globalization with customs checkpoints. Of course, the Portuguese did not rely solely on diplomacy. They were perfectly willing to use force when necessary. Their ships carried powerful cannons that gave them a decisive advantage over many regional fleets. They imposed a licensing system known as cartas, requiring merchant ships to purchase Portuguese passes to sail safely through waters under their influence. Those who refused sometimes found themselves facing confiscation or worse. By modern standards, it could be brutal. But from a strategic standpoint, it was incredibly clever. Instead of trying to govern millions of people, Portugal governed the movement of commerce. There's a lesson here that extends far beyond the 16th century. History often rewards those who understand systems rather than just individual events. Albuquerque understood the system. He realized trade wasn't random. It allowed predictable routes. Geography created bottlenecks. Those bottlenecks created leverage. And leverage in international politics is often more valuable than raw size. This is one of those moments where history starts to rhyme. Because if you fast forward 400 years, you'll discover it follows many of the same routes that spices once did. Different cargo, same geography, same checkpoints. Different empires, same map. The more I study history, the more I'm convinced that geography has an extraordinary memory. Human beings constantly imagine they're creating entirely new worlds. We invent steamships, airplanes, satellites, container ships, AI. We congratulate ourselves in entering a new era. Then we look at a map, and we realize we're still arguing over many of the same places that mattered 500 or 2,000 years ago. The Romans worried about Eastern Mediterranean, the Venetians about access to the Levant, the Portuguese about Hormuz and Malacca. The British would soon worry about exactly the same places. And today, American aircraft carriers patrol waters that Portuguese caravans once sailed, caravels, ships. This isn't a coincidence, it's geography. But no empire lasts forever. Portugal's remarkable success also revealed a fundamental truth about history. Once you demonstrate a profitable strategy, someone bigger eventually copies it. The Dutch noticed, the French noticed, more importantly, the British noticed. They didn't really imitate the Portuguese, they perfected the model. And in doing so, they built the largest maritime empire the world had ever seen. The fascinating part to me isn't that they didn't really invent anything new. It's simply they looked at the map. Albuquerque had studied 2 centuries earlier and came to the exact same conclusion. If you control the world's narrow passageways, you don't have to control the entire world. The next chapter, we'll see how British took that simple Portuguese insight and transformed it into a global empire stretching from Gibraltar to Singapore. And then, almost by accident, another discovery in Persia would change everything once again. It wasn't gold, it wasn't spices. Empires rarely disappear overnight. More often, they slowly hand the baton to the next great power. By the 17th century, Portugal was no longer the rising star of Europe. The Dutch had become formidable competitors. The French were expanding their influence, and before long, another island nation would emerge as the greatest maritime power the world had ever seen. Now, here's what fascinates me. When the British built their empire, they did not invent a completely new strategy. They looked at the same globe the Portuguese had studied 2 centuries earlier, reached almost the exact same conclusion. Control the sea lanes, control the choke points, control the flow of commerce, and the rest tends to follow. Take out a world map for a moment and trace Britain's imperial footprint. There's Gibraltar, guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean, Malta, in the middle of that sea, the Suez Canal after 1882 connecting Europe to Asia, Aden, watching over the entrance to the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, India, the crown jewel of Europe, the empire, Singapore commanding the Strait of Malacca, Hong Kong opening the door to China. If you simply connect those dots, you have one of the greatest logistics networks in history. It wasn't really an empire of land, it was an empire of movement. The British Navy could refuel, repair, and protect ships almost anywhere on the globe. Merchant vessels sailed knowing that somewhere over the horizon the Royal Navy was keeping the sea lanes open. That mattered because Britain understood something economists still teach today. Trade creates wealth, and whoever protects trade often becomes wealthy as well. For much of the 19th century, Britain's greatest export wasn't textiles or machinery, it was stability. Merchants knew that if British sea power kept piracy down and shipping lanes open, commerce flourished. Insurance rates fell. Investment increased, everyone made more money. Of course, that doesn't mean Britain's motives were entirely noble. Empires are rarely charitable institutions, they pursue their own interests first, but history often produces situations where dominant powers' self-interest and the broader world's economic interest happen to overlap. For decades, Britain's prosperity depended on keeping international trade flowing. Then, in the early 20th century, something happened that transformed the strategic value of the Persian Gulf forever. Until this point, Hormuz had been important because it connected trading routes. Now it became something even more valuable, the gateway to the world's energy supply. The turning point came in 1908, the year British prospectors struck oil in Persia, today modern-day Iran. It wasn't the first oil ever discovered, of course. Oil had already been found in places in Pennsylvania and the Russian Empire, but this discovery fundamentally changed Britain's strategic calculations because it occurred in a region the Royal Navy could potentially protect. Around the same time, one remarkable man was wrestling with a controversial idea inside the British government. His name was Winston Churchill. Most people know Churchill as Britain's wartime prime minister during World War II. Few remember that years before that conflict, he served as the First Lord of the Admiralty, effectively overseeing the Royal Navy, and he faced a difficult decision. For a century, Britain's Navy had run on coal. Coal had one enormous advantage. Britain had plenty of it. Coal mines in Wales and northern England helped fuel both the Industrial Revolution and the Royal Navy. From a national security perspective, that was comforting. If war broke out, Britain controlled its own fuel supply. But coal had disadvantages. Coal-powered ships were slower. They required large crews of stokers to shovel fuel into the furnaces around the clock. They produced thick black smoke that could reveal a fleet's position from miles away. Refueling was slow, dirty, labor-intensive. Oil promised something revolutionary. Oil-powered ships could travel farther. They accelerated faster. They required fewer sailors and produced less smoke. In naval warfare, those advantages could mean the difference between victory and defeat. But there was one enormous problem. Britain didn't have much oil. Churchill understood the trade-off perfectly. By converting the Royal Navy from coal to oil, Britain would become militarily stronger, but strategically dependent on foreign energy. Many thought the idea was reckless. Churchill thought standing still was even more dangerous. He famously argued that mastery itself was the prize of the venture. In other words, accepting dependence on overseas oil was the price Britain would pay for maintaining naval supremacy. To make that gamble work, though, Britain invested heavily in the newly formed Anglo-Persian Oil Company, eventually acquiring a controlling stake, a company later known as BP. Think about what had just happened. A decision made in London tied Britain's military future directly to the Persian Gulf. Suddenly, the region wasn't simply another distant corner of the empire, it became essential. Protecting access to Persian oil was no longer an economic issue, it was a national security imperative. And that changed everything. This is one of those moments where you can almost watch history pivot. For centuries, ships had sailed through Hormuz carrying pepper, cinnamon, silk, porcelain, horses, and pearls. Now the cargo was becoming crude oil. The route hadn't changed, the ships had changed. The commodity had changed. But the map hadn't changed at all. I think that's one of the great ironies of history. We often assume technological revolutions erase the past. Sometimes they actually reinforce it. Oil did make Hormuz important. Again, it always had been. Oil made an already important place indispensable. By the outbreak of the First World War, Britain's industrial economy and its navy increasingly depended on secure access to overseas oil supplies. During the Second World War, the importance of Middle East energy only grew. Then came another transition. The British Empire emerged victorious from World War II, but exhausted, financially strained, politically weakened, unable to sustain the global commitments it had made for generations. As Britain slowly withdrew from many of its overseas positions during the decades after the war, another maritime power stepped forward, the United States. Once again, the flag changed, the geography did not. The responsibilities that had once belonged to the Royal Navy increasingly fell on the U.S. Navy. The names of the ships were different. The uniforms were different. But if you looked at the map, American sailors found themselves protecting many of the very same waterways that Portuguese caravels and British battleships had guarded centuries earlier. History, it seems, has a remarkable habit of assigning new actors to very old stages. And nowhere would that become more apparent than in the Persian Gulf during the turbulent decades that followed. Because in the second half of the 20th century, the world's dependence on oil exploded. Cars, commercial aviation, petrochemicals, plastics, modern agriculture, global manufacturing. Virtually every advanced economy became deeply dependent on energy flowing through one narrow passage at the entrance to the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz had always mattered. Now, for the first time in history, the entire industrial world depended upon it. And that dependence would soon be tested. One of the recurring themes in history is that great powers often don't choose their responsibilities, they inherit them. When we look back today, it's easy to imagine that after the Second World War, the United States sat down with a grand blueprint for becoming the world's policeman. But history is usually much messier than that. In 1945, America found itself in a position no other nation had ever occupied before. Its industrial base was intact while much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins, possessed the world's most valuable navy, largest economy, and increasingly the world's reserve currency. With that power came choices. Some Americans wanted to return home, much as they had after the First World War. Others argued that retreat would simply invite another global conflict. The Cold War ultimately settled that debate. As the Soviet Union expanded its influence across Eastern Europe and sought allies throughout the developing world, Washington concluded that it could not simply withdraw from international affairs. The United States didn't just inherit Britain's alliances, it inherited Britain's geography. That's an important distinction. Think again about those maritime crossroads we've been talking about: Gibraltar, Suez Canal, Strait of Malacca, and the Persian Gulf. These places remained just as important in 1955 as they had been in 1855 and before. The names on the naval vessels had changed from HMS to USS, but the shipping lanes were remarkably familiar. I sometimes wonder how strange that would have seemed to a British admiral in 1900. If you had told him that one day American aircraft carriers would patrol the Persian Gulf, American destroyers would escort merchant ships through the Hormuz, and Washington would become deeply involved in Gulf security, he probably would have thought it was implausible. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Not because America wanted an empire in the traditional sense, we can argue about that, because geography presented the same strategic problems to every maritime power. Then came another turning point, oil crisis of the 70s. If you're old enough, like me, you probably remember the photographs. Long lines, well, not even the photographs being there. Long lines of cars stretching around gas stations, air conditioners shut off, by the way. Drivers waiting for hours just to fill their tanks. Signs reading no gas today. Some stations could only sell fuel on odd or even days depending on your license plate number. For younger listeners, it's difficult to appreciate just how shocking those years were. Americans had become accustomed to cheap, abundant energy. Suddenly, they were confronted with the possibility that events thousands of miles away could determine whether they could drive to work. The 1973 oil embargo was a wake-up call. It reminded the industrial world that oil wasn't simply another commodity. It was the lifeblood of modern economies. Then, only a few years later, came the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The Shah, one of America's closest regional allies, fell from power. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile. U.S. Embassy in Tehran was seized. 52 American diplomats held hostage for 444 days. Almost overnight, Washington realized that the Persian Gulf had become one of the center theaters of global strategy. President Jimmy Carter responded with what became known as the Carter Doctrine. His message was remarkably straightforward. Any attempt by an outside power to gain control of the Persian Gulf would be regarded as an attack on the vital interest of the United States. Think about that statement for a moment, and coming from Jimmy Carter. The U.S. was effectively declaring that the security of a waterway halfway around the world had become a core American national security interest. That wasn't because of sentiment. Wasn't because Americans suddenly developed a fascination with Gulf geography. It was because the modern industrial civilization had become dependent upon the uninterrupted flow of energy through the Strait of Hormuz. Then history delivered another test. 1986, Iraq invaded Iran, beginning one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the 20th century. The Iran-Iraq War would eventually last 8 years and claim perhaps 1 million lives. Most people remember the trench warfare and the horrific use of chemical weapons. But another chapter of the conflict receives much less attention. It becomes known as the Tanker War. By the mid-1980s, both Iran and Iraq recognized that neither side could achieve a decisive military victory on land. Instead, they began attacking each other's oil exports. Tankers carrying crude through the Persian Gulf became targets. Missiles struck commercial vehicles. Sea mines damaged ships. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. Merchant captains suddenly found themselves sailing through what had become one of the world's most dangerous waterways. It wasn't simply a regional conflict anymore. It threatened the global economy. Oil prices became volatile. Governments grew nervous. International shipping companies questioned whether they could continue operating safely. Once again, geography had turned the regional war into a global concern. The United States responded with one of the more unusual operations in modern naval history. In 1987, Washington launched the Operation Earnest Will. Rather than directly entering the Iran-Iraq War, the U.S. Navy began escorting Kuwaiti oil tankers through the Gulf after they had been reflagged as American vessels. Imagine that image for a moment. Some of the largest warships ever built escorting slow-moving commercial tankers through a narrow stretch of water. Not because those tankers carried soldiers, not because they carried weapons, because they carried oil. Because the uninterrupted movement of commerce had become a strategic objective all in itself. I think that's one of the great continuities in this entire story. 500 years earlier, Portuguese caravels had sailed to protect spice routes. British warships later protected commercial shipping across the empire. Now American destroyers and aircraft carriers were protecting energy supplies that powered the global economy. Different cargo, different technology, the same mission. Protect the crossroads. What's remarkable is how often we describe these events as though they're entirely new. Every few years, headlines announce that the Strait of Hormuz has become the center of world attention. In reality, it has occupied that role in one form or another for centuries. The players change, the strategic logic doesn't, and that's why I think history is so valuable. It reminds us that today's headlines rarely emerge from nowhere. They're often the latest chapter in stories that began long before any of us were born. As we entered the 21st century, new threats emerged. piracy, ballistic missiles, fast attack boats, naval drones, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, satellite surveillance. The tools became more sophisticated than something Albuquerque or Churchill could have imagined. Yet, if you handed either of them a modern map of the Persian Gulf, I suspect both would recognize the strategic problem immediately. There's still only one way in and only one way out. And that simple geographical fact continues to shape the calculations of presidents, admirals, investors, and energy traders every single day. Which brings us back to the question we asked at the very beginning. Why does one narrow stretch of water matter so much? The answer is not simply oil. The answer is history. And perhaps even more importantly, the answer is geography. Because, as we've been talking about, geography has been asking the same question of every great power for 500 years. Who would keep a doorway open? In our final chapter, I'd like to take some steps back from Hormuz and reflect on what this story teaches us, not just about the Persian Gulf, but about the forces that quietly shape civilizations, often without us even noticing. I think the lesson's much bigger than one waterway. It's about the extraordinary power of maps to influence history long after the people who drew them have disappeared. As we followed this story from medieval merchants to Portuguese explorers, from the British Empire to modern aircraft carriers, you may have noticed something remarkable. Almost everything has changed. The ships have changed, the cargo's changed, the technology has changed, developed, gotten better, if you will. The empires have changed. Even the reasons nations compete have changed. Yet somehow, they keep coming back to the exact same place. That's not a coincidence. It's geography. And I think this is one of the greatest lessons history has to teach us. We live in an age that celebrates technology. Every year, our phones become smarter, our computers become faster, and AI seems capable of doing things that would have seemed impossible, like science fiction, even a decade ago. It's easy to believe that we've somehow escaped the limitations that shaped previous generations. But then something happens. A drought closes part of the Panama Canal. A cargo ship blocks the Suez Canal for 6 days. A war erupts around the Black Sea. Tensions rise in the Strait of Hormuz. Suddenly, we're reminded that for all of our technological sophistication, global commerce still depends on physical geography. It depends on mountains, rivers, harbors, canals, railroads, and even narrow passages of water. Civilization may have moved into the digital age, but our supply chains still travel through the physical world. I remember when the container ship Ever Given became lodged sideways in the Suez Canal back in 2021. For 6 days, the world watched one ship stuck in one canal. There was almost something comical about it. Memes spread across social media. People joked that one captain had managed to stop global trade. But beneath the humor was a serious reality. Hundreds of ships backed up. Manufacturers worried about shortages of supplies. Commodity prices moved. Insurance companies calculated losses. One vessel in one narrow waterway briefly disrupted a trading system that connects billions of people. It was a modern reminder of an ancient truth. The bottleneck still matters. Then there was the drought that affected the Panama Canal. Water levels dropped, forcing authorities to limit the number of ships that could transit each day. Again, global supply chains felt the consequences. Different canals, same lesson. Geography always gets a vote. One of my favorite geographical writers, Robert D. Kaplan, has often argued that geography is the most permanent force in international affairs. Politicians think in terms of election cycles. Business leaders think in terms of quarterly earnings. Military planners in terms of campaigns. Geography thinks in centuries, or perhaps even millennia. That's a wonderfully humbling perspective. It reminds us that history didn't begin with us, and it certainly won't end with us. Think about how many civilizations have looked at the Strait of Hormuz over the centuries. Persian kings, Arab merchants, Portuguese admirals, British colonial officials, American naval commanders, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, sadly, Chinese energy planners, scared. Each generation believed it was confronting entirely new challenges. Yet, All of them were responding to the same piece of geography. Sometimes, I think maps deserve far more credit than they receive, like weather, by the way. After all, maps quietly shape almost every important decision nations make. Where do we build cities? Where do we lay railroads? Where do we construct pipelines? And where do we station military forces? Where do we establish ports? These aren't random choices. They're conversations with geography. And geography doesn't negotiate. There's another lesson here that I think is especially relevant today. When tensions rise in places like the Persian Gulf, it's tempting to see the world through personalities. We focus on presidents, prime ministers, supreme leaders, alive or not, generals. We ask whether a different leader might have made different choices. Surely they would have. Sometimes that's true. Individuals certainly matter. But history also teaches us that leaders inherit constraints they did not create themselves. An American president doesn't get to relocate the Persian Gulf. An Iranian leader can't move the Strait of Hormuz somewhere else. A Chinese leader can't invent another route that magically replaces the Gulf's energy exports overnight. They all inherit the same map. That's why I often smile when commentators describe certain regions as perpetual trouble spots. The phrase makes it sound as though people there simply can't get along. Not true. Sometimes it's part of the story. But another part is that geography has concentrated enormous strategic value in one location. Where strategic value accumulates, competition usually follows. That's true whether we're talking about Constantinople 1,000 years ago, Singapore today, or Hormuz tomorrow. The names change, the patterns do not. There's an old saying in real estate that the three most important things are location, location, location. History might borrow that phrase. The three most important things are geography, geography, geography. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that geography determines everything. It doesn't. Human ingenuity matters enormously. The Dutch reclaimed land from the sea. The Americans built the Panama Canal, after the French tried and failed, by the way. The Egyptians and French built the Suez Canal. Technology can reshape geography to some degree, but notice something interesting. Even those extraordinary engineering achievements didn't eliminate geography. They created new checkpoints. The Panama Canal became strategically important because it connected two oceans. The Suez Canal because it shortened the voyage between Europe and Asia. Human beings solved one geographical problem by creating another. That's classic history. As I prepared this episode, I found myself thinking back to the opening question. Why does the Strait of Hormuz matter? After spending several weeks reading about it, I realized I had been asking the wrong question. The better question is this. Why do narrow places matter so much throughout history? The answer is surprisingly simple. Because they concentrate movement, and wherever movement concentrates, whether people, goods, money, information, and energy, wealth and power usually follow. That's true of ancient caravan routes, it's true of medieval ports, true of railroads, true of airports today, true of fiber optic cables beneath the ocean, and it's true of the Strait of Hormuz. 500 years from now, oil may no longer dominate the world economy. Perhaps ships will run on hydrogen. Perhaps fusion energy will make today's fuels obsolete. Perhaps entirely new technologies will emerge that we can't even imagine. But I suspect historians of the future will be studying Hormuz, not because of oil, because they'll recognize what we've been talking about today. It's one of those rare places where geography quietly shaped the course of civilization. And that's really what this episode has been about. Not merely a strait, not merely oil, not merely today's headlines. It's about the hidden architecture of history. The mountains, rivers, deserts, and waterways that patiently influence human events while the rest of us are busy watching politicians argue on television. The next time you hear a news anchor mention the Strait of Hormuz, I hope you picture something more than a distant waterway on the evening news. Picture Portuguese caravels riding the monsoon winds. Picture British warships guarding the sea lanes of empire. Picture long lines of motorists during the oil crisis of the 1970s and modern tankers threading their way through one narrow opening between Iran and Oman. And then, remember this. History often appears to be written by kings, presidents, and generals. But every once in a while, history reminds us that the most powerful author of all is the map. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Roger Retrospective. If you've enjoyed today's journey through history, I'd appreciate if you subscribe, leave a review, share the podcast with someone who enjoys discovering the deeper stories behind today's headlines. Until next time, I'm Roger Horn. And remember, today's news is often just history, waiting for someone to tell you the rest of the story.